Okay, thank you. All right. It usually takes about 30 seconds for the attendees list to populate. So welcome everyone as you're joining. Oops, let me close mine. Very old school window where I have to wind up to close with a chain. All right. I'm very excited for this lecture. So I'm going to just kick off. And while I'm introducing the series and introducing your own, people will still be joining in. So welcome everyone to the Urban Computation lecture series. This is the third lecture in the series. And if you haven't seen the first two, or if you have, the series kind of investigates issues around how we design urban form and the urban fabric from a computational lens, and what role does computation play. And what we've seen so far in various lectures is that the perception of computation and the role of computation widely differs from how people apply it. So I'm very excited for today's lecture for various reasons. One of them is because Jeroen is a very dear and close friend of mine who I've known for a long time and have worked on non-urban projects in the past. And I've learned a great deal from Jeroen, both from how he deals with clients, from how he deals with people, from how he manages projects at various scales. And so I'm so very grateful that Jeroen is with us today and to share his expertise on a topic that he's actually an expert on. But before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands in UCS in Haymarket, in Harris Street. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I would further like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which our other attendees, all of you out there, are joining us from, and to pay respect to those elders past and present. So a quick introduction to Jeroen's lecture titled Data-Driven Urban Design. And maybe, I don't know, Jeroen, if you have a slide in your lecture, because I know you're also running a lecture series, which is amazing, by the way. So please plug that in if you can. If not, I'll Google it and I'll put a slide at the end. Jeroen van Ameijde is an assistant professor and director of the MSc in Urban Design program at the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He currently explores the application of data-driven methods in teaching, research, and in the analysis and revitalization of Hong Kong's public housing systems. So without further ado, again, Jeroen, thank you so much for joining the series, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for the kind introduction and the reminiscing the sentiments are definitely shared from my side. And funny that even though we started doing small-scale pavilions in Kuwait a long time ago, we're both now interested in urban scale. I would actually argue that there's not so much difference between these kind of small prototypes and urban principles, right? Let me share my screen and just kick off, if that's okay. Can you see this?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay. Great, thanks so much. And please let me know if I'm running a little bit behind. I'll try to stick to 45 minutes, but I do have 160 slides, so it's going to be a little bit of an avalanche. I apologize for that. But yeah, what I'm trying to do is basically show a range of topics related to this title of data-driven design for high-density urban spaces. Obviously, as I'm speaking to you from Hong Kong, most of my research is based in Hong Kong and about Hong Kong. But we try to generalize the knowledge that we generate here in terms of how it is applicable to other cities that have similar levels of urban development and are dealing with intensification of urban density. So I have broken the lecture down in 5 or 6 sort of chapters. So you can keep track as we go through these. And the last one is just a very short sort of reflection on, excuse me, where we might be going with this collective agenda. I have to say I'm obviously doing the talk by myself today, but a lot of the work I'll be presenting today is from my lab, which is currently about 7 people strong. We have 8 actually, I count now. yeah, we have 3 research assistants and 5 PhD students. And since I'm directing the Master of Science Urban Design program, we also work closely with my colleagues who are teaching the studios and the thesis for about 40 students. Because for us, it's a very integrated operation to develop research ideas, small-scale studies that then are further developed in research projects. And we actually have several students graduates from the program that are now PhD students. We also collaborate with a lot of sort of stakeholders and industry partners in Hong Kong, which is very important for us to try, and as we are based in the Faculty of Social Science, and our university, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, is particularly focused on sort of research impact. We are very much interested in collaborating with, for instance, the planning department of the government, the housing authority, to try and work on sort of real world problems and use the sort of theoretical knowledge and methodology development that we do for these kind of practical improvements, if you could call it. So a very quick introduction, why we think it is important to do what we do. Obviously, as we all know, many people are now living in cities. Only small parts of the world, still less than 50% of the population living in cities. And in many places, the cities are bigger than 1 million, especially in the more developing countries. And you see that in the last few hundred years, the proportion of urban population has dramatically increased. But the projection towards 2050 is even more. And if you can see, there may be about 10 billion people living in cities, or living on the planet Earth, and then about 7 billion of them or something in cities. There's a lot of new city building that needs to happen to accommodate all those people. At the same time, we know most of the cities are not in very developed places, and it is projected that the proportion of people living in slums or substandard conditions is not going to go down anytime soon. So there's a real challenge here for urban design to address very systemic issues of quality of life. And also sustainability, obviously, because we know that cities are huge producers of carbon emissions, resource consumption is very high, and therefore cities and urbanization are a huge part of the challenge for the energy transition. We know that in just the last year or two, we've seen more and more of these kind of symptoms of climate change. This is in Germany recently, Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and also the impact of obviously the health challenges around COVID pandemic, Shanghai, or in Hong Kong, or in Brazil. It really focuses the mind on the urgency of understanding how to make better living environments to protect the health and well-being of the citizens. So this is really the sort of research question for all of our work, and also for this lecture today. As there are unprecedented global challenges that point to the need for researchers to address sustainability, we really should look at how urbanization and resource consumption impacts our fragile ecosystems, human and planetary health. And there's a real urgency now to explore how we can conceive and implement sustainable urban design solutions. While there's a range of sustainability initiatives, these often focus on single systems. And what we're interested in is an overall environmental performance approach to understand comprehensively how urban areas shape everyday urban processes and activities and qualities of life. So the basic dilemma behind all of this thinking is that there's a sort of conflict to achieve better sustainable urban form. The compact city is a great model because it sort of takes all of the resources that are spread out in many cities across the world, US, Australia, for instance, if you think of this sort of suburbia, which results in a lot of extra travel, emissions and resource consumption, and puts all of that in close proximity where you have more efficient internal processes and also your safe ecological land. And there's lots of research to show that compact city model improves the use of public transport, for instance, and it helps natural resources by urban containment, let's say. And if you look at Hong Kong, this is a good example of a compact city because only 25% of Hong Kong's land area is used for urban land, and only 7% is actually residential. This is not by choice, but because of the mountains. As you may know, a lot of the land you see here is reclaimed land in the sea, because it's very hard to find any sort of flat pieces of land in Hong Kong. So therefore, we know these sort of famous images of Hong Kong as a forest of skyscrapers. In a way, a good example of the compact city, which affords all sorts of efficiencies, convenience, vibrancy. In a way, also, this contributes to quality of life because there are just more amenities close by where people live. And what's interesting as well, that even the new areas are planned by a sort of default as these very high density, high rise clusters of tower blocks, etc., where you can see a mixture of public and private housing, infrastructure, open spaces, all designed sort of comprehensively at the maximum sort of efficiency of land use and revenue. So there is strong economical forces behind this. It's not necessarily an environmental policy, but nevertheless, there are sort of sustainable benefits. But for instance, such as the modal shift, the ratio of people using public transport. You can see Hong Kong all the way to the top right there in terms of how many kilometers people travel on average as part of their daily routine. There's also negative effects of a high density city. And this is the conflict that I mentioned. You're exposing more people in close proximity to noise and pollution, bad air quality. There may be a lack of public space and public utilities. There may be crowded areas that impact people's mental health. And the prices might go up because of the high density usually leads to gentrification, land value increase, which leads to social segregation. So these sort of images are very beautiful. You see there's very little open space here and a very vibrant mix of functions. But at the same time, we have to question how the quality of life sort of plays out within these urban fabrics. And one of the things that Hong Kong, unfortunately, also is famous for is the result of these very high land values is that sort of outrageously small housing. These are subdivided apartments where a normal apartment of maybe 70 square meters, so 700 square foot, would be subdivided in sort of 5 or 10 units, sort of cubicle size or bed size, or even sometimes coffin size. And this is also an economic force because the landlord can actually earn more income by dividing the units and still renting them out for higher prices per square foot than luxury apartments. You see it in this example that maybe 10 these small spaces share only one toilet and kitchen, and also one window without air conditioning.
62-year-old Jeroen van Ameijde picks his daughter up from school. It's only a 10-minute walk. But in that short distance, they are reminded of where they stand in Hong Kong's property market. Because this is where the Cheongs live. It's known as a partitioned home. Their landlord had divided the original apartment into 4 units and rented them out. The Cheongs have the largest unit, but at 150 square feet, or the equivalent of only 4 queen-size beds, it's still a squeeze. Partitioned homes like this are common in Hong Kong, where only 7% of the island's 1,000 square kilometers is developed for residential use. It is the city's way of packing 7 million people into its small space.
住咗30幾年啦，我都住咁多個單位啊，最大呢個單位㗎啦。以前住嗰啲仲細，都係120尺到啊，幾廿尺到啊。而家呢個單位係算最大嘅。
Big enough for Mr. Chung, perhaps, but not so for his daughter, Elaine.
你最想喺咩地方度住啊？同爸爸父瞓一間房啊，同我費事自己瞓咯，要兩間房。你覺得你幾時可以住到嗰度啊？即係兩間房。我都唔知喎。咁爸爸有錢先咯。
Yes, so when the apartments are so small, the public spaces in between the urban fabric becomes sort of an extension of the domestic sphere. And the quality of the public space has a direct impact on the quality of life. So whether people can conduct small-scale or microeconomic activities, whether they can have socializing and leisure activities for a sense of community and also health, whether they can sit just to have a rest or to socialize, especially sort of disadvantaged groups such as domestic workers on Sundays. And every inch of spare space in Hong Kong, in a way, could be used to have additional activities. And it also points out that there's still a lack of design, a lack of seating in many places. And there's a larger questions here that are crucial about, for instance, what kind of quality of life, what kind of quality of childhood can young children have, for instance, when they grow up in these kind of conditions where everything is so tightly controlled and regulated. So I showed kind of two conditions in Hong Kong. In a way, the unplanned areas, which are still remnants of the colonial time, were sort of small-scale plot and mixed use. But mostly now all the new areas are following this sort of planned model of land use planning and function separation. And this is very important to understand. If we want to propose any improvements or changes to this model, we need to understand how this is sort of implemented. Of course, there's a legacy of modernism, which is based on great ideas of equal access to light and ventilation and green spaces, etc. Then if you see in Hong Kong the implementation being much denser, you see that it's more of an efficiency argument rather than equality. And many of the new towns and the new urban areas are developed as a collection of self-contained estates where the housing are sort of grouped inwards and the public spaces and facilities are all in the center without much communication in between them. So many of these new towns are shown as sort of good examples of livability, quality of life, but at the same time, there's lots of things we can learn from what is not so successful in these places. And this is really a question of planning and design. And Hong Kong has a sort of whole laboratory of experiments from the 60s, 70s, 1980s, 1990s, all looking into different kind of patterns, spatial configurations, landscaping and public facilities planning that have a direct impact on the quality of living, the everyday patterns of movements and activities of residents in this very high density city. So how can we understand this relationship between urban planning, urban design, and everyday life? So part of our research, my own research, is about public housing, where we look, for instance, at the history and the evolution of the patterns of the estates layouts, where we can see a very interesting relation between, for instance, the block typology and the estate layout typology, where, for instance, in the 1980s, there was a kind of a left-wing government and you see the spaces in the blocks increasing and the landscape qualities increasing. But then in the 90s, there was a bit of an economic crisis, and then the spaces get tighter again. So it's very interesting to see these kind of waves of new ideas coming in. These kind of estates were built around the first SARS epidemic, the local sort of SARS crisis. So in response to that, government decided to have every new estate following a sort of site-specific and non-standard approach, where there's breeze corridors, ventilation, etc. So the public spaces also went from something that looks quite sort of European to very Hong Kong-specific typologies with good quality public spaces, to something that is much more squeezed and standardized, to a kind of even a famous example of a new town in the north near Shenzhen, which received the nickname the City of Misery, just because it had proportionally such high instances of domestic violence and suicide. And in response to that, we have now the non-standard planning approach, which is in a way a very clever title, because technically it's sort of a game of combinatory logics of using very similar units that are just sort of recombined in different patterns. So the site-specific approach is very sensitive to climate and environment, microclimate, but not necessarily improving the variation and the quality of public space in relation to quality of life. So how can we address these issues? How can we design and approach urban planning, not from a sort of object and efficiency planning approach, where the towers are planned first and then the public spaces are sort of a leftover or a sort of secondary consideration, but really start from the idea of livability first. So one of my PhD students is now working on a framework to understand what livability actually means. She looked at a lot of literature about, starting from Plato and Aristotle, all the way up to very recent academic research about quality of life. She looked also at these kind of index systems, such as Mercer, that rank the cities across the world in terms of livability. Vienna is always #1, and Hong Kong is somewhere quite low down the ranking. To understand how these measurement systems can work and whether we can actually use these measurement systems to make local analysis and improvement. Turned out Mercer is not very useful, but a lot of academic research is, and when you combine these all into comprehensive framework, maybe organized around qualities of life as defined by Maslow, you can actually have a sort of checklist, shopping list of different facilities and also their conditions. So whether the facilities are there, but also whether they're accessible, whether they're affordable, whether they have good quality, security, appeal, diversity of choice, etc. And this was just published in Cities Journal, in case you're interested to read more about this. And the next stage, we're looking to apply this in detail to Hong Kong for a sort of regional comparison. Another PhD student is looking at using Google Street View images to analyze street view qualities. Many people are doing this now, but in Hong Kong, this is extra interesting because these tools are developed sort of in the US for self-driving cars, right? So they analyze greenery and sky view, etc. But in Hong Kong, it's much more important, for instance, to look at retail and people counting on the sidewalks, which can also be done with these tools, but you have to kind of reconfigure the methodology and retrain the machine learning algorithms, etc. And then you can do very interesting analysis about different regional differences in these kind of new towns that we're interested in, to understand where there's more vibrancy and pedestrian density, and this is related to function mix, land use mix, etc. We also do local studies of urban spaces using drone scanning, bit of machine learning already getting built into these tools now, so we can separate the ground from the buildings, etc. And then again, many other research groups around the world are doing this, you know, scanning social media data, open source, for instance, OpenStreetMap data, to gather all the points of interest, classify them in different categories, understand, you know, for instance, the popularity using Google review data, etc., to do this very comprehensive analysis of existing urban districts. And so we're not so interested in just the tools and the sort of urban informatics side of it, but we're interested, because we're in the Faculty of Social Science, how can we use this to understand the sort of human side of urban fabric, the communities, the access to facilities, the attractiveness of street spaces for socializing and everyday activities. This is a paper in last Cadria conference, if you want to read more. And so what's more interesting is, how do you evaluate these data? How do you make a sort of top level assessment about whether there's certain areas that don't have good access, whether if there are certain barriers in the urban fabric, like a main road, for instance, that sort of, especially for elderly people, is very difficult to cross, especially in the hot climate. So when you put all these different layers together, can you make a much more sort of surgical intervention in relation to all the problems that you identify, and then test out sort of quantitatively whether the solutions are performing well? This, of course, is inspired by Wallasey, I have to say, but we didn't get a chance to run that full automated process. So we have done, you know, last year with the students, sort of manual multiple objective optimization process. Nevertheless, trying to, you know, compare the impact of different urban massing options on different qualities, such as pedestrian networks and choice of the routes, etc., to really understand, and also the environmental qualities, etc., to really understand whether you can make a new project that sort of fix some of the problems in the surroundings in the larger area. So, and then other research that we're doing is zooming in even more, because we're very interested in even single public spaces. As I pointed out earlier, public space in Hong Kong is extremely important in terms of quality of life, socializing, sense of community. So we're also very interested in environmental behavior studies and the psychology and perception of public space. I already mentioned Maslow's theory of human needs. And this is not necessarily interesting for its hierarchy, but more for its sort of comprehensiveness, to understand that you shouldn't only look at safety and, you know, put lots of barriers there so people don't walk into the street, but also understand, you know, the connectivity, because people want to participate in everyday socializing, to feel part of a community, especially if you think of, for instance, a lonely elderly person in an all public housing apartment. And especially the top of the pyramid is something very underappreciated in urban design and urban planning, that neighborhoods should have qualities that allow communities to develop themselves, to develop social capital, to improve personal health, but also longer term skills and other kind of personal, let's say, abilities that helps people become the best version of themselves. So how can we use this framework, this theory, to analyze existing estates and their capacity to support communities and individuals? As I mentioned, Hong Kong public space is very sparse, very precious, and still there is lots of it that is not used. Why? Right? Maybe because there's no place to sit, or it's too hot, or there's other things about psychology, such as it's too visible, there's no privacy. So we analyze with students in a sort of lots of different courses, mapping behavior, activities, counting, drawing, measuring, and we make lots of maps. Some of them are done by hand to try and sketch out the patterns of density in relation to the different type of activity, the time of the day, but also in relation to microclimate, sun and shadow, but also visibility, the capacity to see or be seen. in relation to network integration, centrality, etc. So based on that, we can actually understand that some places have a very extrovert character. So, you know, when you sit there, you see a lot of other people, and you know people can see you. So this will attract certain kind of character people, right? People that are not afraid to say hello or to show themselves. Not everyone wants this, so there also need to be introvert areas, there need to be private socializing areas for people who want to have a quiet conversation or do something semi-legal, such as gambling. There need to be areas for exercising, you know, for instance, for women that don't want to be stared at by passers-by, so they feel comfortable to do their Tai Chi or yoga, etc. Teenagers notoriously sensitive to you know, being seen by others, right? They need to have places outside of playgrounds for kids. It's something not really understood or accommodated. So we can sort of analyze, in a way, criticize a little bit, but actually some of the older housing estates in Hong Kong are very good, surprisingly, in terms of their capacity to accommodate different personalities. So can we use digital tools as well for this understanding and then also addressing this with design? Can we use the drone scanning, people mapping, etc.? So here we see a drone scan of a housing estate, and then we can map people activities across different times of the day, weekdays and weekends. And for instance, we can take all the locations and put them into Grasshopper and analyze personal space, social space, etc., using Edward Hall's sort of classification. So then we can actually map which areas statistically are used for more dense socializing and which ones are more private, which is very interesting because all that data has the timestamps and you know, geolocated information connected to it. So we can, almost like a Google restaurant review, we can kind of check whether playground is used more frequently during certain times of the day, etc., or by certain size of groups. And this is one of the big projects that we're working on with a sort of government grant on Thai Estate, which is one of the new housing estates in Hong Kong, following that on a site-specific non-standard approach. So you may agree with me, it looks a little bit standardized in some ways as well. Where we try to connect this sort of people analysis to feasibility analysis to go more into detail about how the perception of spaces actually works. So we look at isophys theory, different ways of calculating isophys, from a single point in space to sort of isophys fields, right? Visibility graph analysis, where we can project grids over all of the public space and make calculations for each cell. And also borrowing from other scholars, develop our own 3D isophys methodology, where we actually plug in the point cloud model from the drone scan directly without having, you know, the need for making a Rhino model and analyze the 3D visibility, because obviously in Hong Kong, it's not so effective to only look in 2D to analyze things like enclosedness, where it's very different whether you're in a big open space or sort of half underneath a building to understand the different qualities of seating, for instance. So this is sort of work in progress. We're developing our own workflow, even, you know, separating estate spaces with sort of compact partitions automatically to understand certain parameters for these different spatial cells, and then understand, first of all, how existing planning methods work to assign different activities to different quality spaces, and then see if we can run a sort of optimization on that based on the understanding of what kind of activities need which kind of privacy levels or connectivity levels. So, and all this actually sort of sits within the agenda of placemaking. It's a very important concept that we reference a lot in papers, because it's really about a sort of community-led process, right? Placemaking is not about urban design, it's about how residents or local users create meaning and assign meaning and let's say a sense of belonging, a place attachment to the spaces in the city. So it's about understanding how people actually are attracted, how they move, how they view space, how they respond to features in the landscape, and how they make conscious or subconscious decisions about maybe redirecting their movement or speed in relation to those features or in relation to other people in the same space. So we're working on this framework using also a bit of machine learning to process the video footage. Again, other people are using this too. We're not inventing things completely from scratch, but we try to apply it in an interesting way to our sort of social science agenda. Actually, we tried 2 different methods because it's very hard to get access to CCTV, etc. So one experiment, we flew 4 drones for 20 minutes, depending on battery life. So using them sort of as temporary CCTVs to film space from different angles, so we can cover more complex spaces. And then in another experiment, we actually have dash cam cameras on tripods on the buildings. Of course, we have to do full research ethics application and get permission from the building sort of management. So this is at the moment only possible in the CUHK campus. But what this does is both do very short and high resolution studies with the drones, and also longer time frame studies of 24 hours or even longer with the camera. So we're checking, different algorithms and calibrations to check the accuracy. And then what's really great is this kind of tracking starts to happen, right? Because the algorithms can assign unique identifier labels to each individual object. In this case, we're only filtering out humans, and kind of trace them, even if they disappear from view a bit, or they're in clusters of 2 or 3 people, depending on the resolution and the quality and the training, mostly because the pavement obviously different colors, etc. So we're still sort of improving that workflow, but what we managed is that we can track people's movements into trajectories that then we can project onto the drone scan into the public space, onto the floor surface. So actually sort of recalculating pixels on an image to geolocation coordinates in the world sort of space. And what's super interesting, we can then connect our previous sort of tricks about analyzing interpersonal distances to understand, whether people are alone or working in small groups or passing by close to other people or not. And then, collect data over a period of time, map that onto a grid of space to understand more of the sort of statistical qualities of space. So moving from a human-centric to a space-centric analysis of the social qualities of urban form. You can also read more about this in last year's Cadria paper. What we're currently doing now is to go further into this idea of environmental behavior and environmental psychology to understand the notion of co-presence and co-awareness in relation to placemaking. So we use the data we generate from the paths trajectories to also understand people's viewing orientation and their field of view. So in connection with the time, we can actually understand whether people may have the possibility to see each other or make eye contact. And this is very interesting. Just from snapshots over time from video footage, we can deduct information about where people were at which point in time and whether they were able to see other people within a certain distance and range. So what this does is allow us to analyze certain behaviors, not just data, but sort of decision making, right? Whether they were able to see each other, whether they were close to each other, and then whether maybe they deviated from the path to avoid other people, or actually maybe the other way around, get attracted to other people, whether they're turning to static behavior, they're stopping and chatting, or maybe walking together for a certain amount of time and distance. So, and then we can project that back onto the space and really start to understand the interrelationship, the correlations between you know, certain landscape features, such as a sculpture or a bench or a piece of shadow, you know, in a very hot summer day, and whether people are more inclined to start socializing there. And we are particularly interested in sort of spontaneous social interactions, which are quite hard to detect, but we're working on that. You know, people that don't know each other striking up a conversation or have some kind of a friendly interaction. Even though this is all currently being done at the university campus, the ultimate goal is that this will apply to the public housing, where it's very important to understand whether neighbors that don't know each other, that are maybe from different social groups or age groups, just because of the landscape features and the public space layout and configuration, are inclined to engage in friendly, casual socializing, which over time could lead to the forming of supportive communities, which of course helps things like aging in place, this kind of famous concept where Hong Kong government and other countries across the world are trying to stimulate elderly people to stay at home and be part of an active community as long as possible. So the final thoughts, let's see how I'm doing for time. So I rushed through this quite quickly. I may have some time to spare, but then we have more for Q&A, because I wanted to finish with a provocation where this may be leading to. It's really the idea of connecting everything, right? Connecting the research and the design and the interest in people movements and activities and the mapping of them to some kind of feedback loop. Some people would call it sort of cybernetics approach to urban planning, right? Of course, Mohammed knows I show this reference in all my lectures. The sort of theoretical precedent for this is the Seek installation by Nicholas Negroponte, where there is a kind of machinic control, right? A system that tries to help the residents achieve their ideal sort of environment based on monitoring resident behavior. And we know that Negroponte was working with Jona Friedman and Gordon Pask at the time on the idea of the sort of soft architecture machine, right? Where the designer's role is no longer just to design a fixed urban form that is kind of handed over to a client like a product, and then the responsibility of the designer is finished. But rather instead, the role of the urban designer is sort of a systems designer that eventually provides a service to local residents and public space users to help them achieve good quality of experiences and quality of life. But in a way, this task is never finished, right? And the responsibility doesn't end when the design is done, because the design is never done. When the system is in place, it can continue to monitor and learn and upgrade the public spaces in relation to how it evaluates how people are actually using the spaces. So this is my interpretation of Jona Friedman's diagram about the architecture machine, and also Negroponte's Seek installation, where you can think actually through these different steps of gathering data, then interpreting them in terms of pattern recognition, spatial structure, then making some kind of decision about the intervention based on your rules or your policy about what is good and what is bad. So what do you want to promote or get more of, and which things you want to sort of clean up or discourage. And then you translate it to an action, which doesn't have to be with robots at all. It can be just with normal processes of public space management or upgrading through contractors, etc. But the main idea is that this is in a feedback loop, right? So this is periodically, continuously ongoing. So just as a final thought experiment, if we look at this slide where we know in detail, the user behaviors over time based on the existing landscape. So we know actually how successful and popular the different features are. We can respond to that, right? By, for instance, having a kind of a modular system that gets implemented in a very simple way, by understanding which features you can give more facilities or which are not popular and then remove them, etc. So in a way, create a very participatory and in a way democratic system where the users in the end sort of decide what kind of public space they want in relation to their individual and community needs. Again, this is not something just for this lecture, but something I've been thinking about for a while and also written about in several publications. One of these you can find very easily online as well if you're interested in this. So final thoughts. If you as well want to participate, right, in not just a changing role of urban designer, architects, urban planners, but really also to address these very rapidly changing society because of all the digital technologies that are increasingly embedded and shaping everyday life. We really need to understand that everything is becoming digital, including both practice as well as the products and the applications that we design. So therefore, we need to stop thinking about data and data analysis and think about how to get information, knowledge, and wisdom from those layers so that we can not just sort of analyze and absorb, but also start to interact and transform society. So there's really, different levels of participating in the digital society. Instead of being ignorant, it's already good to have some awareness. But if you master the tools and understand the theoretical implications of these processes, you're empowering yourself so you can contribute to the transformations that are happening to our urban societies. Thanks so much. And please get in touch.
Amazing. Can I just ask that you leave the slide up just for people to be able to take photos? Questions are already coming in. For those of you who aren't familiar with Jeroen's work, I hope that has not only tickled your interest, because it is so fascinating to see how much work you've done in Hong Kong. Like, wow, that is like, because I know I've been, I visited you many years ago, and this is fantastic. So definitely my recommendation is to follow Jeroen on his Instagram. He uploads some really kick-ass images that are very inspiring, and also you can find information about the lecture series he's currently running on his Insta as well. So definitely do that. Jeroen, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
If you have it, that'd be great. If you can bring it up.
Sorry, I need to. No. This one, yeah.
Perfect. Yes, that's the one. And I noticed that you had a QR code somewhere for people to zoom in.
Because I'm sharing my Zoom screen, I'm having some difficulty. Okay, let's do it like this. Sorry about that.
It's all right. No, it's perfect. Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Just try to pretend to be very digitally adapted.
Yeah, there you go. There's the QR code.
Yeah, this is the lecture series. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks very much for that. And yeah, so I think like the way you presented your work, I feel this is kind of a sneak peek for what one could expect from this lecture series. And I'm so glad that you are running this lecture series. I'm definitely going to join all of them. I missed the last one, unfortunately, by 2 hours, just because I got my time zones mixed up, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're also recording them.
Okay, super.
Them available publicly, but if you get in touch with me, I can send you the link.
Super, amazing. So let's jump into questions. And again, I will take advantage of me being the moderator to ask the first question. And maybe this is something that we were discussing before we went live with the webinar. You mentioned something that I found was very interesting, is how much you had to learn or relearn your understanding of kind of urban life when you moved to Hong Kong. And then when I see all this work, I'm like, yeah, this makes so much sense. But perhaps just opening discussion to the attendees, can you expand a little bit on that? So, you know, prior to kind of experiencing all that Hong Kong has to offer from an urban sense, what changed both in you, your perception, and your understanding of urban space? I'd really love to know that.
Yeah, great question. Thanks so much. And you know, but maybe not everyone else knows that, yeah, before I was living for 11 years in London and teaching at AA, we are already tackling some of these topics actually with our students there about, you know, privatization of public space, how public spaces are or are not in some cases a platform for cultural expression, community forming, etc. We're also looking at gentrification, and we're looking at high density housing. It's just that in London, you somehow sort of theorize a lot and make beautiful projects that are very sort of speculative and provocative. But at the same time, they're, let's say, design concepts, right? And the difference for me is having moved to a different city, but also working now in a research university, which has a very different focus and in a way a series of pressures about you know, research output and grant applications and then citations, etc. But I find this quite stimulating in a way because it really forces the mind to think about how research can make a meaningful impact to society. And especially since it's clear there are a lot of problems that are just at a different scale of magnitude than they exist in London. And not just talking about Hong Kong, but if you look at the whole Greater Bay Area, mainland China, but also the wider region, if you look at, you know, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, etc. There's a lot of rapidly urbanizing areas that don't actually have a lot of infrastructure, no metro lines, no, you know, comprehensive planning approach with good quality public spaces. It just kind of happens by itself, right? So this notion of urbanism without planning or architecture without architects, that is much stronger here. And it's very interesting to sort of understand the underlying forces here because they're really happening very fast and without much sort of debate. And it's also really economical, right? The underlying forces. Hong Kong is famous obviously for its sort of free economic system. So it's really about, you know, maximizing the efficiency of everything. And then, you know, being in the Faculty of Social Science, where you have lots of colleagues in other departments asking, so what? But wait a minute, you know, what about recent immigrants or people with low incomes or you know, that are just have different needs from just getting from A to B as efficiently as possible to get to work, right? What about all the other activities that make up the quality of life? Somehow it's really clear that in many areas of Hong Kong, this is not at the forefront of the planning consideration, right? But Hong Kong is changing now as well, right? It's becoming more clear that it's becoming more important also to maintain its competitive position in the Greater Bay Area, right? As a city that is sort of Asia's world city that has world-leading financial and research institutions, etc. So people are becoming more aware that it's also important to offer good quality living environments and not just very efficient infrastructure, etc. So there's opportunity to contribute, and that is very exciting. But at the same time, there's a lot of sort of methodology development that we need to do before we can actually pinpoint exactly, you know, how to make improvement.
Which is, I mean, which is very evident in your work, because much of what you're presented are different ways in which you can develop methods and methodologies to collect data and use data, which was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to jump to some of the questions. So Adrian, who's been joining all the previous lectures, says, super compelling projects. Thanks so much for presenting. Ethics approval aside, which, by the way, congratulations on getting ethics approval. I just don't want to gloss over the difficulty of getting ethics approval in universities. I'm struggling with one as we speak. Must we rely on invasive systems for improving design? So given community engagement, frameworks have shown to greatly improve urban design. How do you imagine these two systems working together? Would you show people their own habits as a part of the process, or use it to inform design recommendations you can then table to the broader community?
It's a really, really good question, and it sort of puts, the finger at a place where it hurts and then pokes a little bit, right? Which is
I might meet Adrian later tonight, so I'll poke him really hard on your behalf.
Yeah.
All right.
No, it's good because it's a question that always comes up in like peer review, etc. Actually, I've just finished a Springer chapter about this issue, which reference a lot of literature about smart city skepticism. So this question is similar, right? For instance, if you look at the case study of Toronto sidewalk labs and how people organized to sort of push back against the local government working together with Google to sort of commodify urban data, right? And maybe, selling the privacy at a little bit price that is too high for in turn of, in exchange for private entities providing public services. So this is sort of a bigger question, and the solution that some scholars offer is, that there should really be protocols in place for data protection, or having transparent data processing protocols, or sort of data commons, right, where all the data is publicly accessible and everyone can see how it's being used, and it's according to certain standards. Why I still believe it's important to have a sort of a wide canvassing approach is exactly because of the idea of inclusivity. We know, and there have been many sort of community engagement processes, but they're sometimes a little bit, tokenized, right? They become a sort of little gesture or tick box that developers or authorities do to ask a little bit, local residents' opinions. But the way the sample or the group of people is selected, or the ones that volunteer to come forward, is not necessarily representative, and also it hasn't continuously happened over time, right? It's still part of a linear process where the data is gathered, then some decisions are made, usually top down, and then the thing gets implemented, whatever it is. So the things I'm thinking about with many colleagues here is really beyond community engagement, but how to have a much more systematic participatory system in place that does sort of adhere to certain standards, ethics standards and safeguards, by anonymizing data, etc., only extracting statistics. But at the same time, that really, includes everyone that is sort of moving through the space, right? So you have to therefore be kind of invasive. But I acknowledge that this is very tricky, and potentially there's a dark side or a dangerous side to that kind of setup, definitely. So but if you look at MIT, etc., they're doing lots of these projects around open data that are scanning and gathering lots of data, right? It's bound to happen anyway, because of the pervasiveness of sensing technologies and devices in the urban environment, etc. But we got to address this issue, and if we don't address it as architects and urban designers, then we would leave it to the big tech companies to just sort of take advantage of it and run away with the systems, and then it will be too late, right? So we got to engage in this field and experiment with it to understand actually what is important and what we don't want with this.
That's fantastic. I completely agree. And two specific points. One being actually the second half of Adrian's question, which was, which I think kind of supports what your response, which is you don't necessarily have to continuously record everyone and everything. The idea is that you're kind of creating correlations from a subset, from a small amount of data that can perhaps apply for the broader community. And of course, the research implications of that on how adaptable and how much it can be applied to the broader community, then I guess that's another question. But I think that's key here, right? It's not like everyone and everything. And secondly, a colleague of mine who here at UTS, Linda Matthews, her research kind of takes advantage of publicly available CCTV, where she just kind of logs into a camera that is recording a street in New York and gathers the information about how people are using a street. So as you mentioned, I think much of this data is already being done and being recorded. I think it's our ethical responsibility to engage with it in a proper way. So yeah, superb. Next question, which is, this is amazing. This is from David Scher. David, unless someone else has the exact same name, was one of the first students I have in the first studio I taught at UTS, and his project was the Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong. So yeah, so I'm so glad that he's asking a question. The question is, after mapping out the various social behavioral patterns, do you think it is possible to facilitate them to occur in future city planning? This, I think, comes back to the application to broader community question. If so, would such an approach then become a top-down approach that may not be site-specific and create an undesirable outcome? Are we kind of going back to a bit of a generic? Okay, I didn't think we were going to ask this question, but I think we're going to start to ask this question. How far do you feel that the correlations you created from a subset of the data is applicable to a larger, broader community? That's the first one. And then the second one for me is it applicable to communities that come from different backgrounds, different country, different culture, different climates, geology and geography?
Yeah, super important question as well. Yes, so the first point to make is that it's extremely important to, I think, not conceive of these kind of cybernetic systems or feedback loops as something that is fully automatic. That maybe cybernetic is kind of a wrong analogy, right? Because it should really be a sort of community-driven and user-friendly system that is open to scrutiny and debate as well. So I'm always also for mixed methods approach. So don't only use video analysis, but also do interviews, because actually there may be people that are not using public space, that you wouldn't capture otherwise, and you actually want to know why they're not using the public space, right? So the other issue is how much is it generalizable. This is really up to sort of critical reflection. It's hard to answer also in a general way about which lessons apply universally and which lessons are site or user group specific. Yeah, you really have to think about going in detail. If you look at the field of and the papers on environment psychology, for instance, they discuss that certain things are really instinctive. They're quite universal, and they have been doing research all over the world and find certain things are the same. But for instance, what Jan Gehl called the edge effect, right? The idea that people feel safer when they have a barrier behind them because their eyes are in the front, so it's less likely that there will be attackers coming from the back, right? So people just like to sit with the back against the wall and survey an open space, and especially if the open space has good views so they can see if anyone scary is coming and they have enough escape routes, right? So there's certain things about safety and this kind of fight or flight responses. They're very animalistic in a way, right, in humans, and that seem to have been proven by researchers, prospect refuge theory. Other things are very culturally specific. For instance, in Hong Kong, there's a very trusting society where generally it's quite safe at night, and people will not necessarily, go around to avoid each other, or they wouldn't hesitate to walk through areas that are a bit messy or dark. But it could be very different in Brooklyn or Sao Paulo, right? So you might actually die if you do that. So it's I think very important to, think of the limitations of your research and not make too quickly sort of generalizable conclusions, sort of transplanting findings to alien locations. So for our research on public housing, for instance, we look specifically at Hong Kong public housing, and also we separate different age groups and even personality types. And then we don't claim that you could just apply that in Singapore or even to private housing in Hong Kong. But we claim that it will be applicable and useful in new public housing, right? So how to learn from existing public housing and about which public spaces work and don't work, to understand which places people really like and use, right? And then obviously when you interview them, you could actually ask them as well, why they like them, etc. But sometimes, the stated preferences are still slightly different from the sort of demonstrated preferences. So it's good to have a mixed methods approach.
And I'm just kind of wary of time, so maybe this will be the last question, and then I think we'll end there. So Manisha's, again, brilliant presentation. The question is, how far is this research multidisciplinary? And which I'm assuming it is quite multidisciplinary, but if you can expand on that. And you mentioned that there is a relationship that you're developing with the Hong Kong Planning Department. Can you expand on that perhaps? How is there adoption by the planning department on these methods for future planning regulations?
Not yet, unfortunately, but this is a longer term goal. So currently we're collaborating with the Hong Kong Planning Department as part of their community engagement sort of duty. Because with the urban design program in the masters here, we have another sort of long-term agenda, which is about new town planning, because Hong Kong has already had sort of 4 generations of new towns with different sort of planning models. And now they're still planning a new generation of at least 4 or 5 new towns. So the question is that they also put to us, what is the new town model? And for instance, part of that is a huge a set of artificial islands, about 1,000 hectares off the coast of Hong Kong Island, in between Hong Kong Island and the airport, which is a kind of very interesting opportunity because it's a little bit of a tabula rasa. So you can really think about what kind of ideal model of community configurations you would like to implement there, right? And then the question is, how can we learn from the past planning, let's say, ambitions, and also the lessons learned from what works and what doesn't work? So looking at a lot of detail at those new towns to inform sort of the active strategies that are being sort of right now thought about and refined for implementation in those new towns. Actually, Matthew is also working on this with Arab. So a lot of it is a little bit sort of under secrecy clauses, but we're working with our urban design program. But whether they're going to use anything that we propose to them is not clear. Of course, they wouldn't be able to say because that would be preference policy, and they have to sort of consult all different groups within community.
Yeah.
Multidisciplinary is in relation to the toolkit that we have. I forgot to advertise that, but if you go to our urban design website, we have a beautiful set of micro modules that are currently still open for anyone across the world to do a bit of self-learning. And a lot of those are, incorporating knowledge from data science, geography, mathematics, statistical analysis, also data visualization, etc., GIS, etc. So we're trying to bring in some specialties from different disciplines to improve the research skills of our urban design and urban studies students, and try to also connect better to those other fields in terms of how our research can be implemented.
Super. That was great. That was really fascinating. Thank you very much, Jeroen, for your time and presenting your fantastic work. Again, for any of you who want to learn more about Jeroen, please get in touch with him. He's super responsive, as I can definitely attest over 10 years of knowing him. So one of the very few people who are. By all means, please make sure that you attend his lecture series as well, because I think it carries on this discussion through much more lectures. And thanks, Jeroen. Jeroen just pasted the link to the website in the chat. If you want to check it out, click on the link, please. And again, Jeroen, thank you very much. That was absolutely amazing. Super, super grateful for your time and for sharing all that fantastic knowledge with us. Thank you again.
Pleasure to be with you, and hopefully continue talking about these interesting topics. Yeah,
Definitely.
thanks so much, Mohammed.
Thanks again, everyone. Thank you all. See you later. Goodbye.